Hello everyone and welcome to this webinar hosted by thedriven.io and brought to you also by ABB. Look, a really interesting day. Our topic today is the EV transition policy and practice, and we're going to be looking at some of the issues and the opportunities in Australia, but of course it's also happening on the same day as Tesla's battery day, so we'll be having a look at that as well. We're expecting a big crowd on the webinar today. Not quite as many as turned up for Tesla's battery day, of course, but we're still thankful for your presence here. And I know that there's a lot of interest in EVs in Australia and obviously around the world. We've got a great panel here today, and I'm just going to introduce them very briefly. We have Shane Rattenbury, the Minister for Climate Change and Sustainability with the ACT government. Which of course is one of the governments leading the charge, so to speak, on electric vehicles and coming up for an important election in the next month or so. We have Evan Walker, the Director of Transport at the New South Wales Smart Innovation Centre and part of the New South Wales government, and thank you very much for joining us, Evan. We had Behyad Jafari, who is the CEO of the Electric Vehicle Council. That's the key lobby group which unites a whole bunch of different manufacturers and car makers and charging people and other stakeholders who are really looking for the development of electric vehicle policy in Australia. And we have Steve Amor, who's the head of the electric vehicle segment for ABB Australia, part of one of the biggest engineering electrical companies in the world, and a very big player in this segment. My name is Giles Parkinson. I'm the editor and founder of Renew Economy and also thedriven.io. And we actually launched The Driven about 2 years ago. We sort of saw that the interest was there in electric vehicles, and my goodness me, it certainly has been confirmed. I'm pretty pleased to report that this month, we'll probably have more than 1 million page views and 400,000 unique visitors to the website, which means it's catching up to Renew Economy. And I just think it just shows the breadth of interest in electric vehicles. And I think we see that both in the uptake of electric vehicles, but also the interest. And I know one of the issues in Australia is people waiting for policies or a range of models that they can afford and they like, because not everyone wants a Tesla or a Nissan Leaf or a Hyundai Kona or the other things on option. And there's clearly not enough models at low cost. But anyway, we're going to start now. I do encourage you, we've got a pretty good crowd here already. I do encourage you to lodge some questions. I'm going to field some questions initially, mostly about Battery Day and some of the policy announcement recently and what some people are doing. And then I'm hoping that there's a lot of questions from the audience because we really want to make it a bit of a discussion. So look, Battery Day was held this morning. Nearly 500,000 people tuned in to watch it on different different means on YouTube and on their live stream. There was a couple of hundred people sitting in an extraordinary, looked like an old drive-in theatre, sitting there for the AGM and the Battery Day thing. It was quite extraordinary. And Elon Musk and his head of battery technology was up there. Behyad, let's start with you. What was your big takeout from Battery Day? I mean, I guess there was a lot of hype around it. There was talk about a 1 million mile battery and things like that. I don't know whether we quite got to 1 million miles, but it seems to me that there was quite important announcements in terms of reduction in battery costs, improvement in efficiencies, and Tesla move for being a fully integrated company, even to the point where it's actually going to mine its own lithium.
Yeah, I think what it spoke to for me is we certainly spend every day talking about things like the falling cost curve for batteries and for electric vehicles as a result of them, the type of uptake projections that we expect based off those cost curves, both for total cost of ownership and upfront costs. And it's very easy, I think, to sometimes get trapped in looking at those as lines on a graph and think, well, this is what it's all about. Come 2023, come 2025, we'll hit this price point, and therefore we're going to get better, cheaper vehicles that are that have better power and performance than ICEs. Therefore, it will take off. But really, the day was about showing the type of work and innovation it takes to make those lines go where they go on that chart, right? It doesn't just happen naturally. People are working on this every day. For us here in Australia, I think what it really spoke to is when it comes to doing that work is the type of opportunities that exist within that innovation. You look at I think if you remember I encourage you to check out, I think there's a website that I understand is #1 for electric vehicle news. I can see behind your shoulder there, where you can read a more detailed article about some of the announcements. And you see that getting the things like a 50% price reduction for the battery pack, a 50% or 60% increase in range in the battery pack, comes down to 6 or 7 different segments within the construction of the battery itself. And inside of that, there are concept places where I can see, well, Australia could be doing something there. Australia could slot itself in quite easily there. And I won't step too much on questions that I know that we have coming up, but particularly when I think about the type of actions that we're taking in the policy space to sort of bounce back better out of things like the pandemic, but also charting our course over the next 10 years and over the next 20 years. Well, this investment isn't potential, it's happening right now. And some of the leading, the most valuable car company in the world is driving some of this work right now. Really we should be entering ourselves into the conversation more, and we see some of those timelines of how much time we have in order to get those opportunities, because come 2023, that next vehicle gets built, that next battery is already on the market, and it's too late for us to be the providers.
Absolutely, yes. And there's also the launch of a new VW electric vehicle happening overnight tonight. So more cars are coming into the market. Evan, maybe I'll just turn to you now and just find out what you took out of Battery Day. I guess, the lowering in the battery costs, is that significant for you?
Yeah, Giles, yeah, I found it really interesting. I mean, our organisation's really focused on public transport. So the transition of our bus fleet to zero emissions is a really big target of ours, and one of the big limitations, obviously, especially when it comes to bus, because of the range and the number of passengers, is the capacity of batteries. So hearing news about extended range and lower size for batteries, look, it's really fantastic, and that's the kind of thing we're really looking for from industry to help support that kind of transition of things like buses. So yeah, look, really exciting things to come out of that. And I think that other point that Behyad made before around, the opportunity for Australia around, battery manufacture or being part of that process and that supply chain, I think that's a really great point as well, because it's a disruptive space from a technology point of view. There's traditional car making's changed, and where the energy comes from for transport's changing. So all really positive stuff, I think.
Steve, maybe just go to you. We'll get back to the policy questions very soon, but Steve, get your take quickly on Battery Day.
I think, Giles, the big thing was passion. The amount of people that dialed in, the innovative drive-in theatre that Mr. Musk was standing up and talking in front of. It's for such a new company that is really, when you compare it to the other automobile manufacturers around the world, they've had their challenges, and he acknowledged that, and developing the Model I and Model Y, I should say, as he said, was one of the smoothest release so far, and developing these cars with much longer battery life and range. This is something, as a charging supplier, we're working with manufacturers all around the world and trying to develop our chargers to suit these cars, suit these battery management systems. So to see this will only lift the bar further for all the other manufacturers, and it'll allow more choice coming down in the range of cars as well. So I just think the passion that people have for this particular maker car and this manufacturer and Elon Musk and his development and his team behind that is quite exciting for the industry.
Let's get on to policy now. Shane Rattenbury, you're the Minister for Climate Change in the ACT. You're at the forefront there. We might not get you to speak on the federal policy at the moment, but just tell us some of the initiatives that you are doing in the ACT, because it's possibly what some other people would hope would happen for the rest of the country. But tell us what you're doing there. Shane, you're going to have to unmute.
Of course, rookie error. Look, we set a policy a couple of years ago to start transitioning the ACT government's fleet. We've got several hundred vehicles in our fleet, so it's not the size of the Commonwealth fleet, but it's certainly a sizable fleet. And we have now started bringing EVs in. Like most big commercial fleets, our vehicles are on a 3-year lease cycle. So basically, as they're coming out of cycle now, they are being replaced with EVs. We've had a great response. We've had an 80% reduction in running costs for the vehicles compared to the petrol model that they would be replacing. What that's seen is by adjusting our lease cycle to a 4-year cycle instead of a 3-year cycle, the ACT government has been able to make having EVs in our fleet essentially cost neutral. They're very popular with our public servants. Our fleet managers say their biggest problem is everybody wants the EVs, not the old cars. And we've had some great public education out of having these programs. One of my favourite examples is some of our community nurses have been the first adopters of these vehicles. When they drive them around, they often get their patients saying, "Oh, I didn't hear you pull up." And so it immediately begins a conversation about the electric vehicles. So they're also sort of an ambassador out there talking to people about the fact that they're driving an EV around town, and people ask them all sorts of questions. So this policy, I think, has been very effective, firstly in creating a market for vehicles. Secondly, it'll create a second-hand supply of vehicles as they come out the other side. But it's also just driven a lot of conversation amongst both our own public servants and members of the community they're engaging with. And I think that's an important part of where EVs are at in Australia at the moment.
And what's your forecast? I think I don't know whether it's ACT policy yet, but it might be sort of the Greens platform in that coming election. Is it for 90%, I think, is it EV uptake for government vehicles by 2030?
Yeah, we are in the middle of election campaign now. And as the leader of the Greens, I just put a policy out a week or so ago in which we have set a goal to have 90% of new car sales in the ACT to be zero-emission vehicles by 2030. We, as you probably know, and many of your listeners will know, the ACT is now at 100% renewable electricity. So that's cut all of those emissions out of our profile. We've now got more than 60% of our greenhouse gas emissions coming from transport. So it's the area we really need to focus on. And we need to get cracking on this issue of transitioning our fleet to being a zero-emission fleet. And I think in setting a goal like this, one of the things we believe it can do is give the automakers confidence that they can start to have a sustainable market here in Australia and start, going back to your earlier point, start to bring more models in, get greater choice, see prices start to come down. We know that the two main barriers for people are price and range anxiety. And so the policy is all about trying to both set that long-term goal, and then we've put in place a proposal to have a $10,000 subsidy for residents of the ACT to be able to get an electric vehicle, and then also the charging infrastructure to go with it. They're the things we think will really start to kick a market along here in the ACT.
Well, that's fantastic. My mum lives in the ACT, so I might get on the phone to her and suggest she could price herself an electric vehicle, although I think she might be past the driving stage now. But anyway, Behyad, there's been a flurry of energy announcements in the last week from the federal government. What was in there for electric vehicles? Was there very much? Were you disappointed, elated? And what more do you think needs to be done in the short term? Because Shane just talked about, choice and range anxiety and price. I mean, are we addressing any of those yet?
Yeah, so from the low emissions technology statement and announcement, and to say that there is a later electric vehicle policy to come, hopefully later this year, from the federal government as well. There we saw, I think it totaled to $74.5 million for what's called a future fuels fund. And so that's looking to go towards providing funding for obviously public charging infrastructure, but also thinking about commercial and logistics centres. And they're usually for looking at the commercial sector in the bus sector, for instance, and Shane from the ACT would know this very well, that quite a lot of those vehicles are already in the money. It makes sense, for instance, to transition to electric buses because they're already cheaper today. For quite a lot of commercial vehicles, particularly vans and light trucks, a lot of the time they're also cheaper to transition to electric. Some of those pain points are sort of one-off associated infrastructure build-outs. So things like upgrading the capacity to a site in order to enable it to be electric forever. And particularly if you're looking at all of the vehicles in that site being electric. So thinking about how government can help to target some investment towards helping that one-off cost, sort of relieving the burden of some of those one-off costs. So that by itself is great, right? It's $75 million more than was on the table this time last week. So that's quite a good thing. I think when we talk about the size of the potential that the electrification of transport and electric vehicles provide for Australia, even just from a market perspective, even just from shifting from petrol and diesel towards electric vehicles, and then adding on top of that the huge sort of industry development and job creation potential for Australia, there are far too few zeros behind that, right? I think when it comes to developing good policy for e-mobility, Like to joke that we have two governments in Canberra, and unfortunately, from my perspective, the wrong ones are in the wrong seats. You know, I'd rather have a changed government being in, although not removing you from the good people of Canberra either, but it'd be good to have you sort of governing for the wider country, because similarly, the type of proposals like shifting towards 90% electric by 2030, these are considered outrageous, you know, in most parts of the world. We saw just earlier this week or late last week, the UK announcing that they're now looking at banning internal combustion engine sales, including hybrids, by 2030. I think really fascinating there of governments who have set these targets and gone about trying to achieve them. What we've seen in the UK example is in the past 18 months almost, they've set a target of 2040, they've started working towards it, and they realised, hang on, we could do it by 2035, hang on, we could do it by 2030, and now we think we could do it by 2032, now by 2030. So governments actually taking the action and working towards these things get the right results, and they're able to work faster.
Just quickly back to you, Shane, because there's an interesting question about targets. The federal government's made it quite clear it doesn't want targets, it wants to let the market operate by itself. But Canberra has, or the ACT, sorry, has had a target for electricity, 100%. It's got there. Now it has a target for 90%. I mean, presumably you would say, well, the obvious question, I guess the answer is obvious too, targets do work.
Absolutely, Giles, and Behyad's made that point quite well. Back in 2010, we set a goal here in the ACT that we wanted to cut our greenhouse emissions by 40% by 2020. And to be honest, at the time, I wasn't sure how we'd get there. But having set the target, you know, our public service then started working on it, business started giving us ideas, and we have cut our emissions by 40% by 2020, predominantly through getting to that big electricity target that you've spoken of. And I think putting the target in place and shooting for it, look, if you end up falling a few percent short, you get a lot further than you would have by having the target.
Yeah. Absolutely. Steve, you saw the policy announcements in the last week. What reaction do you have, or maybe you'd be more comfortable with the question about what more do you want to see, particularly for your area of business?
Yeah, thanks, Giles. Look, I totally agree with what Behyad and Shane have been talking about. We've been really banging on about you know, the consistency of the approach from all the governments with regard to you know, the uptake of EV and the rollout of public charging. One of the biggest issues, obviously, people not believing there's enough charging out there, getting trapped in a car with a flat battery and not knowing how to move on. These incentives only encourage, you know, not only regional governments to get involved, but we're seeing a lot of commercial opportunity. And of course, even with the buses, which, you know, Evan will talk about shortly, is with, you know, getting people into buses, getting them off the road and actually in buses, and reducing the actual traffic on the road. It's got a double-edged sword. So I think it can only be good. And I'm looking forward to working with people, you know, and solving these issues that we're going through.
Fantastic. Evan, you're with the Department Director of Transport at the Smart Innovation Centre. Can you just give us a bit of an update of where you're at with policy in New South Wales, and what your focus is on at the moment? Because I know your minister is the only minister in Australia and possibly the world driving a Model 3, so presumably the whole department will be very soon.
Yeah, so I don't, it's Matt Keane. He's not my minister. I work for Andrew Constance's team, but yeah, no, I know he drives Model 3, and look, it's a really interesting point for us. So it was only started last year that we worked on a whole of government EV and hybrid vehicle plan. We set a 10% target for new government fleet vehicles to be EV and plug-in hybrid, and we hit that within 3 or 4 months. The Matt Keane's department now, they've put out a net zero plan, so quickly it started to accelerate already. They've made some announcements out of that, but already that government targets that, you know, we've extended that again, and we'll extend it again. So I think that the pace of change is really rapid, and hearing what Shane was talking about before, it really resonates when we're thinking about some of the other bits and pieces we're doing. So we were kind of leading the way in New South Wales with some small scale charging projects, but that's already going to get superseded in the next few months with the net zero plan activities. And then, so the thing we're really focused on at Transport for New South Wales is the transition of our bus fleet. So our minister came out and said he was keen to transition the whole 8,000 buses across New South Wales to zero emissions technology. That's 4,000 in Greater Sydney, 1,000 in now outer regional metro areas, and then 3,000 in regional New South Wales. And it's a really huge task for us to start thinking about, but it's something we're in the midst of contemplating right now. And we've had 5 buses running around the inner west of Sydney already as part of a bus contract. We've just put electric buses onto our bus panel so all our operators can purchase them now. And we're in the middle of an expression of interest that Steve would be familiar with, where we're looking for the market to come and pitch to us potential trials to help with that transition. What's the latest battery technology? What's the latest financing models? What are all those great things that can help push this transition along? And I think we've done some analysis. We know that currently battery technology can do a pretty significant part of the task, which we weren't aware of before. And the more you think about it and the more you look at it, you start to feel you can go a bit faster and a bit harder. So, and the other thing that I think is really of note for us is the response we've got from industry to us putting a few things out there. First to our minister's announcement, then to the EOI we've put out. Everyone from the bus supply chain in Australia to our operators, to companies like ABB, to the technology providers, they've just come through the door and said, hey, we want to participate in this. We've got some great ideas. We're just looking for the signals from government, which we're hoping we can provide in a real meaningful way.
Good stuff. Hey, we're going to go into audience questions now because they're queuing up. Just for the audience, there's a lot of questions which I can see in the chat panel, and that's great to have in the chat panel. But if you've got any questions that you'd like to have answered, could you just move them over to the Q&A? Otherwise, it's just a bit too much for me to sort of keep abreast of, and just sort of for management purposes, because I can see a few in there. But anyway, look, and let's make the answers reasonably short, unless you've got a really, really great story to tell. Behyad, we're going to start with you. From Paul, what are your predictions for the ARENA Future Fuels Fund? And I guess the essence of that question is how much is going to go to biofuels, how much for EV, and how much for hydrogen?
Yeah, and I do say that we have some people who really should be the ones answering the questions, asking some questions and making some chat comments. So a great audience to have here. I think really importantly, what the next steps of something like the Future Fuels Funds will go through now are its allocation to something like ARENA, and then how ARENA chooses to spend that money. Really importantly, what that means is that it is a co-investment, so projects will need to actually come up, and interesting projects and financially viable projects will need to be presented to the board of ARENA for co-funding. So I think that will likely mean that we would expect to see that 90–95% of that will be going towards e-mobility, because that's where the investment is today, and possibly seeing some sort of lighthouse investments and lighthouse projects in the certainly in the H2O space, and potentially in the biofuel space as well. But really, just given the way that the funding needs to be allocated, we would expect that, and some of that as well is back up to us as an industry to make sure that they're seeing a lot of those proposals, and because we know that the appetite for investment's there. Yeah.
Shane, another question for you. How important is government procurement as a leader? And just to answer on behalf of you immediately, I'm guessing for the second-hand market, but I'll let you answer fully.
No, it's a good point, Giles. I think there's a couple of factors that government procurement plays. One is it does, given how few vehicles we have in Australia and the hesitancy of vehicle makers to bring the cars here, I think that certainty of a decent-sized market is very important at this early stage of the market in Australia. But the second is the second-hand market there. If we want to enable average people on an average income to be able to get an EV, that second-hand market is really important, and I think that is certainly part of it. The third observation I'd make is just about developing expertise and confidence. That, in terms of servicing, I touched on earlier, people seeing the vehicles around, those sort of things I think are quite important as well. I saw a few comments after I talked about range anxiety in the chat box, and I take the critiques of the term, but I think outside of the sort of people who are on this conference call, it's a real issue. The average person out there who's not deeply into EVs is really worried about this sort of stuff. And so I think we need to make the real effort to drive those educational efforts and show what is possible, so that the average person who knows not much about electric vehicles, their confidence starts to grow in their capability.
I think the education, the information is really important. And I'm just looking at the chat actually there's Edmund has talked about the challenges how we can drive from Sydney to Melbourne in 8 hours. I guess that's the average time that people do in a fossil fuel car. My own experience from going from the Byron Bay area down to Sydney and Canberra is that it actually takes no longer than it does in my old diesel car. My pattern of stopping is a bit different. I've got 3 stops for about 20 minutes each, 30 minutes each, but when I have a diesel car, I'll probably stop for an hour and a half at lunch. And so not really much different at all, but that's the importance of having enough infrastructure down along the road. And I guess at the moment, we've got just enough for the amount of vehicles that are there at the moment. We clearly need more. Hey, Steve, I'm from ABB. Here's one for you, because you guys are interested in the rollout of charging stations. And the question here from Roy is, why haven't petrol companies installed chargers at their petrol stations? Seems logical. Is it a deliberate decision?
It's
actually starting to do it in some places.
No, it's actually, if you look at overseas markets, it's actually one of the biggest growth areas, the oil industry, and we've been involved with Shell Connect, for instance, and BP with their EV rollouts in their own. We've seen a lot of combined stations overseas, but not so many here. Our first installation in Euroa is actually at a fuel station, but it's at a franchise station. But people want to see chargers at these stations, like you were saying, coming down from Byron Bay down to Sydney. You want that confidence that the place that I would have normally pulled over and be able to have a coffee, maybe just sit down, have a bit of a break. It's a safety issue as well. This is something that people are looking for in a service station, the traditional market. So I see that the traditional service stations in the city will probably start to reduce in the inner cities, but in the outer ways, it's definitely a market for them. And even people like Ampol, for instance, with their convenience stores, this is an attractive way of getting people into those convenience stores. So charging's definitely coming into those markets, and we're certainly seeing that. The inquiries coming through, it'll happen for sure.
Evan, there's a question here, and I'm just trying to find it now. I saw it before. It was a question about buses and whether it's going to be likely to be electric or be hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. Have you guys been sort of weighing the two together, and how are you looking at that issue?
Yeah, look, absolutely, we're considering both. So the recent EOI we went out with, we're looking at both battery electric. Well, we're looking for zero emissions technology, so we're not being prescriptive on whether it's battery or it's hydrogen. It's really what can deliver the operational requirements we have. So if I look at the current kind of batteries in buses at the moment, they're anything up from between 200 to 400 kilowatt hours. They can probably on a hot day in Sydney do between 2 and 250 kilometres, carrying a standard city bus. So then there's a lot of that's about 70% of our network. And there's another part of our network where our question is, can battery get there? So that's when we start looking at hydrogen as well. So we're really invested in looking at both, and just trying to understand as we move through a transition, how those different technologies are going to evolve. So nothing's off the table, but it's really focused on our achieving our customer outcomes. Because at the end of the day, when you're transitioning a bus fleet, you've still got to make sure that people's buses show up on time, that they do the routes they can do, that it doesn't cost the state more. So it's really looking at whatever technology can do that, and hydrogen's firmly in the mix with that. I think battery electric technology is a bit more mature, especially in Australia, than hydrogen, and there's still some stuff for us to understand with hydrogen, but yeah, we're really keen to trial it and to see how it works for us.
Steve, can I just throw that back at you? I mean, Elon Musk was pretty clear what he thought. Naturally, I mean, he's in electric vehicles and full battery storage, and he thought that it was going to be battery all the way through. He didn't see much of an opportunity for hydrogen. But as ABB is an enormous global company, when you're looking at your technologies and your offerings, I mean, do you have a foot in the door in hydrogen? Are you sort of straddling both technologies, or are you pretty confident that it'll be battery electric?
I think we put our eggs in the electric basket, but that doesn't mean to say that there's not room for both. When you talk to people like Scott Naga from Hyundai, there is definitely room for both. Where people are looking at electricity, That's a cheap way of doing it. You can refill at home. The convenience factor is there. Hydrogen definitely is something for people looking at distance. I can see the heavy haulage industry and the coach industry getting involved in that. And either way, I think the net result is reduced emissions, and I think that's what we're all here for. So I think ABB has its mission to zero policy about our blueprint for industry with regard to self-sufficient energy and emissions, and I think that just covers both.
Yeah. I've just got one quick question which I'm going to answer. Someone, Phil, is asking what the chances are of Tesla importing Chinese-made EVs into Australia, Model 3 and Model Y. I think they've actually suggested that that's exactly what's going to happen. We don't actually know when that's going to happen, but they're being a bit cagey about the timing for that. But they did announce last week that the Shanghai factory will be making right-hand drives for the Australian market, and that's definitely the case for Model 3. Model Y, we still don't quite yet know when it's going to get here. Shane, back to you. It's talking about you've already answered about what you've got for your driving principles. How to convince, you sit in those energy COAG meetings, not called COAG anymore, but how do you convince the other ministers to do the same?
That really is the million-dollar question, Giles. And I've spent a lot of time trying to convince Angus Taylor of various things, and with limited success. But look, if the Commonwealth Government, for example, was to apply the same sort of policy to their fleet as the ACT government has applied, it would make an enormous difference. They've got a much bigger fleet than we have, and it would start to build those scale issues that I think are really important. I think we're making some progress. If you think back to the federal election where we saw a real culture war on electric vehicles, I do feel we've moved past that a bit. I'm more encouraged by some of the signals we're seeing out of the federal government, and I hope we'll start to look at these issues a bit more on merit. But I'd certainly also encourage the other state governments, and some of them are. I was pleased to hear what everyone was saying earlier about the New South Wales government sort of setting targets and then meeting them really easily and going on. I think that's what people are finding. That's where you'll see a difference come from government.
Another question back for you, Steve, actually, and this is sort of another thing about convincing other people, and this one's about the incumbent industry, and it says the Australian auto industry still appears to be in denial about the underlying causes of the decline in new car sales since mid-2018. Any views on when they will address the realities of the ICE-EV transition? And this is certainly something that we see when we see the reporting about from the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries about the decline in car sales. I've actually never seen electric vehicles mentioned. It's all been one thing or the other. Yet we see from various studies that a lot of people really want to have an EV, so maybe people are holding on to their current car for longer. So the question to me, from me to you is, I guess, is when you obviously talk to the auto industry, you talk to a lot of the people who are encompassing the petrol station owners and all the car manufacturer representatives here. How does that conversation go when you're talking to them? I mean, are they kind of engaged? Are they trying to sort of pretend it's not really happening, or are they kind of secretly working behind the scenes to see how they can jump quite quickly?
Giles, we're talking with them all the time, as you say, and really, I think every manufacturer that's currently in the market and a number in the sidelines that wants to join the market has got an EV program, and they're all very keen to get involved. And I think one of the doorstops there is really the take up and the actual, the policy that actually is driving the sales of these. As Shane said, these manufacturers are not encouraged to bring cars into this country because we don't have a market. So there's a number of manufacturers that quite openly have said that we're not bringing our cars here because your market just can't sustain our vehicles and other markets don't have enough of them. So, it's something that we need to see the media, people, like yourself, promoting more and more. And I think, as you said, your readership has gone up massively. And you only had to look at today's announcement with Tesla. Anyone who had half an interest in electric cars was on there worldwide. So, just in my small circle of relationships and people that I'm aware of, everyone's asking me. I'm the expert apparently on EV. And I'm sure Behyad and Shane and even Evan would have the same thing, and yourself, Giles. They want to know about it. They want the questions are there, and it's up to us to just keep promoting it, get out there, and make sure that people understand about the connections, about how long it takes to charge, you know, the different varying ways that you're going to refill, rather than, you know, go to empty and then refill again. You'll be gradually doing that, and you'll be working with different suppliers. It won't be just the, you know, a fuel station. It'll be a retail store. It might be your gym that you'll be refilling at, or you'll be refilling at home, and the convenience of that. So all these different factors are what people are looking and are interested in. And we only have to look at how many people that are listening to us today, 445 people. So, you know, it's definitely on people's mind.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I've got a next question for Behyad, but before I do that, I'd just like to remind all the panelists that if you do hop onto that Q&A part, there's some direct questions, and maybe you can answer them, some of them directly if they're directed personally to you. So please do that. Behyad, there's a couple of questions here about gigafactories, and one part of the question was Elon Musk talked about having a gigafactory on every continent, and someone's rightly pointed out that Australia is a continent, so why can't we have one as well? And there's another question that went with that, is that if we were going to have one, then what sort of incentives would the state governments or anyone would need to do to actually make it happen? Look, there has been talk of a couple of gigafactories, one in, I think, in Townsville in Queensland. Gigafactory might be a generous term for that scale of that factory. I actually wrote last week that Mike Cannon-Brookes is planning this world's biggest factory in the Northern Territory, so almost enough to justify a factory just to build that. But what's your view of this situation?
Yeah, I guess and rather than sort of speaking about the specific projects, taking a broader view of how possible it is and what it takes, it's why we do keep hearing about these individual projects and ideas and sort of thoughts for Australia, because on face value, it makes a lot of sense for Australia. We know we sort of make we have 9 out of the 10 metals required to make the batteries here. A lot of the expertise inside of the battery metal space do reside in Australia because we have those minerals as well. So it's not just having the rocks, but it's having the brains to think about what do you do with it after you dig it out of the ground. So that supply chain potential is there, and certainly it's the ability to service the Australian market, but then also have those really great relationships and trade agreements across our region as well, makes it a quite lucrative place to base operations like that, as opposed to having to, for instance, ship them from the US if you're Tesla. Really the big thing for us here is and what we hear from investors, particularly in the battery space, but in the electric vehicle space as well, is when we look to land our sort of investments in manufacturing that come with thousands of jobs and, you know, millions, if not hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of associated investment. We get off the plane in a range of countries, and we have governments throwing themselves at us saying, yes, please come invest here. We're all for this. We're pushing to 100% electric vehicles. We're doing everything we possibly can. Bring your business here. And we get here and, you know, we see the Prime Minister saying silly things on the television, and we think, well, is this a country that gets it or not? Do we really want to be landing ourselves and sticking around for a couple of decades? It doesn't completely turn them off, but like I say, it creates a bit of an uneven playing field for us. I think when I'll just focus on the federal government for a moment. I think what we've seen there is that Austrade, for instance, has produced a report around the economic potential for Australia from the lithium supply chain. And they produced a fantastic report that looked at all the parts of that lithium supply chain that we could play a role. And what it found was that the opportunity was huge for Australia, both from an economic investment and from a job creation potential. And then that was it. And so it's this huge opportunity, and then no policy, no anything to back that up. So really the ability for Australia to have one or multiple gigafactories is certainly there for us. And there are, you know, investors there waiting to come and land and to, you know, provide those facilities here in Australia. But a table has two ends to it. We have to be there on the other end, encouraging them to show up and, you know, ready to receive them.
Okay. Evan, over to you. There's a couple of questions here about New South Wales. Not too sure if you're in a position to answer them, but I'll give it a go anyway. It's anonymous attendee actually got two questions, and they're kind of related. I live in New South Wales. What incentive is there for me to install charging infrastructure at my home so I can be ready for when I replace my vehicle? And one that goes with us is, we're talking about battery electric vehicles. It's a chicken and egg thing. Do you actually go for the infrastructure first or move to reduce the cost of the vehicles?
Yeah, look, they're both really good questions. in terms of incentives for people to install electric vehicle charging in their own homes, it's not an area I'm looking at myself, but in the net zero strategy, there's definitely some incentives being looked at right now around charging. Whether that applies to homes, I'm not 100% sure on it. But one of the comments I'd make is, you know, the total cost of ownership of EVs, you know, when we look at buses, it's obviously very good. But for private vehicles, it's starting to get to a point where they'll make sense to people. So, but right now, you know, I can understand that some people feel the need for incentives. In terms of the broader infrastructure question, you know, we've taken a position that we think we need to build charging infrastructure as a government and support the building of it. We've got a couple of projects already. We're looking at fast chargers in our regional on our regional road network to deal with things like range anxiety, but also to help promote the idea that if you've got an EV, you're not restricted from travelling around different parts of the state, which is probably really important at the current, you know, point in time where you can't really travel outside the state. So that's what that's about. But the other thing we're really interested in is the value of charging on our transport assets. So obviously lots of people who probably want to buy EVs, and I've heard this from industry, they don't necessarily have a car park, especially in parts of Sydney, like the inner city, where, you know, you've got on-street parking, you've got people who are really forward-thinking. They'd love to have a Tesla Model 3 or a Hyundai or something like that, but they don't have anywhere to charge it. So we're really trying to explore the value of putting charging in our car parks on our transport network to kind of promote the use of public transport as well, but also support those kind of customers who want to make that choice but don't have that ideal charging situation themselves. So I think it is a bit of a chicken and egg proposition, but I think from government's point of view, there is a role where we can start to push a couple of levers in the right direction to really help people make a choice, which we think is really ultimately beneficial.
Mm. Shane, a Shane from you question. A question for you, Shane. What does the panel think can be done to assist the bottom-up rather than top-down transition?
And just picking up from the point Evan was just making on that, Giles, I think that one of the big misconceptions about vehicles is actually what people's usage pattern is. You know, you hear people talking about, oh, well, I've got to have this enormous range. And the reality is, if I think about most people here in Canberra, they'd be hard pressed to drive more than 80 kilometres in a day. And in other places, that would be, you know, variants of that. You know, it's not that often that most of us do a long driving trip somewhere. You know, and I think we need to talk to people about what their actual vehicle usage is, because that will build some of that confidence as well. And actually see people, you know, if you think about a two-car household, you can easily have an EV with a range of 150 k's for getting around town, and you might still have an ICE sitting in the garage when you've got to drive to Dubbo to see your parents on the weekend, or whatever the story is. And I think they're the conversations we need to start to have with the community as well, including even how much charging infrastructure we need. The reality is, and again, I take Evan's point about people in Sydney and apartment buildings, but, you know, places like Canberra, you've got a lot of people living in single unit dwellings. They've got a garage with a power point in it. And so they actually don't need a charging station most of the time. And these are the conversations where you see the detractors go, oh, you can't do it because of this and you can't do it because of that. But they're the hard cases. So many of the examples are actually easy cases. And I think that's part of the conversation to have with the community as well.
Mm. Steve, maybe you should hop in here too about charging, because you guys specialise in charges. I mean, you're doing big charges and you're doing little charges. So how are you seeing the balance, and will there be such a thing as too many EV charging stations, given that every power point in the country is the potential?
Never too many charging stations, Giles. Come on. Now, I just want to add something about the incentive for people that to put a charger in their home. I think most people these days, when they're looking at you know, buying a home, they're looking for the latest convenience, especially for building it. Solar is pretty much got to have it now. You know, the insulation on your windows, home automation. With the amount of cars that are coming onto this market, if you don't have installation for charging or provision for charging in your home, it's going to be harder to get the right price when you go to sell that home. So that's an incentive in itself as well, I think. But as far as charging going, you know, where the rollout of charges are, we're seeing a massive uptake in AC charges for personal use. This is a massive growth area. We've got a lot of our electrical wholesalers and resellers that are looking to get involved in this. The inquiries they're getting from contractors and developers about trying to cater for the future demand of vehicles. As far as public charging is going, we're seeing a shift away from people are starting to understand that if you're putting public charging in, it's normally there for a reason, and a lot of the times it might be in strip parking or in a shopping centre parking, that sort of thing, where you want utilisation of charging infrastructure, getting utilisation of the car park. An AC charger just doesn't cut it. It doesn't give you enough extra range, because what we're looking at is not filling from full to empty, but giving you enough range to get to the next place. Like Shane was saying, understanding where you're going and how often you're using it. So we're seeing the market in public charging, move from a 22 kilowatt AC to a 24 kilowatt DC, 50 kilowatt, and then in some cases bigger ones again. So it is very much a cross section, but that sweet spot, I think, at the moment is around 24 kilowatt to 50 kilowatts still for commercial charging, for commercial public charging. It'll remain that way for a little while, but I think ABB is developing further down below 24 kilowatt, and next year we'll be having smaller chargers again, which will enable people to be able to charge and get somewhere around 3 kilometers of range every minute of charge, and that very quick amount of charge will allow you to get your minimum runs for the day. So yeah.
Just, Behyad, I'm going to throw a couple of detailed policy questions at you. A couple of questions here about tax incentives and things like that. One from our famous anonymous attendee about what can we expect from federal incentives for EV adoption, such as LCT, that's luxury car tax exemption, stamp duty exemption, etc. And another question about what are the chances of getting FBT parity from the federal government. Any thoughts? I mean, you're obviously talking to them.
Yeah, let me take a step back first and say I think what we've really seen is, over multiple years, state and territories as well as local governments have been the ones sort of stepping up and filling that void of trying to provide the electric vehicle policies that they can in the absence of a federal policy. While there have been sort of these one-off bits of funding, like arena funding for electric vehicle charging, and as time has continued to spread and the federal government still hasn't developed an electric vehicle policy, it's where we've seen the type of action that we're seeing in the ACT, where states and territories are becoming more ambitious and saying, okay, we're going to have to do even more of the heavy lifting here. So I think when it comes to things like incentives, we'll increasingly be seeing those coming at least first from state governments, state and territory governments, apologies, and then increasingly as well when it comes for instance, home charging or other public charging infrastructure. We're particularly seeing quite a lot of local governments starting to fill that gap and saying we want to make sure our community and our residents, and very importantly, potential visitors to our community and our residents have access to electric vehicle charging so that they're stopping by here on the way and spending their money in our communities. For the federal government, I think there's a few people have pointed to some really telling aspects there of, for instance, looking at things like fringe benefits taxes and the adjustments required to make that an even playing field, and then due to the lower operating cost of electric vehicles, essentially allowing for an incentive in the tax system. That sentence sounds very clunky, and I think that's the type of electric vehicle policy that will be successful with the federal government, because what it doesn't sound like is 100% electric vehicles by 2030. And I think that's the type of statement that I would not expect to see coming out of Angus Taylor's mouth. But making these slight tweaks to different tax codes and different regulatory codes that recognizes that they're, remembering a lot of these taxes and regulations were written pre-electric vehicles, or at least pre-mainstream electric vehicles, so recognises that there is this technological transition going on and appropriately updates them, but also through inference provides some level of incentive and some level of encouragement for electrification is where we're spending a lot more time targeting towards, because we can help shift. I think there's another question there saying, since we don't have those big ticket policy items, where will the impetus come from? I guess we're looking at where can we do very targeted actions, and a lot of the times it is things like whether they're government or corporate fleets, by helping adjusting some of the numbers in the spreadsheet for when it comes time to buying a new fleet of vehicles, to saying, okay, well, the electric ones make sense for us now. And then you've got, if you can make a company move, much like the ACT government move, then you get 100 vehicle sales at a time, as opposed to one or two at a time.
Good question for you, actually. Another question. We're down to the last 10 minutes now. We've still got lots of questions. Let's make the answers as quick as we can. Just briefly, does Angus Taylor know he's not the Minister for Transport and the Minister for Electric Vehicles, or where does the policy development lie, as far as you understand? Is it with Angus Taylor, or is it with the Minister for Transport, McCormack?
No, it is certainly when it comes to the National Electric Vehicle Strategy that is sitting with Minister Taylor in what was previously and still exists on paper the Ministerial Forum on Light Vehicle Emissions that developed some of the regulations around vehicle emissions. That was both sitting with the Minister for Urban Infrastructure, which is the Minister under Minister McCormack, and Angus Taylor. But as I say, that's a committee that exists on paper now. They don't actually really meet or do anything anymore.
So who's making the decisions?
The person who should be making the decisions or is responsible for them right now is Angus Taylor, but I won't say in terms of who actually is making those decisions.
Yeah. Evan, just a very quick one. You talking with a question about local councils. Are you, from the state government point of view, are you talking to local councils at all? To what extent?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of local councils are really interested in this space, whether it be from the fleet point of view, or how they can get involved in, having electric buses in their town centres, because it's great for placemaking. So there's a whole range of different reasons why we engage with local councils, but yeah, they're a really important stakeholder for us. And we've got pretty good relationships with them, depending on the particular issue at large. But by and large, across Sydney, there's been a whole lot of local councils who've stepped into EVs and incorporated them as part of their fleet. So yeah, really important stakeholder for us, for sure.
Shane, I'm going to come back to you. There's a few questions here about hydrogen, and a lot of people picking up on the interest about Elon Musk talking about 3 terawatt hours of battery storage capacity being delivered by 2030, which probably suggests to him that it's going to be more batteries. ACT, and will that run over hydrogen? And ACT is an interesting position because you're straddling both technologies at the moment. You've got your electric vehicle targets, but you've also got a fleet of about 20 Hyundai fuel cell vehicles. Now, my understanding is that they're not being very charged at the moment because there's an issue with with an infrastructure thanks to COVID restrictions. But how are you looking at that? Are you still got your foot in both camps, or are you sort of leaning one towards the other?
Now, we've been very clear that we have a zero-emission vehicle policy. And so we've tried to not cut ourselves out of one approach or the other. I think the EVs are way ahead, but we do have these hydrogen vehicles. They're here in Canberra, ready to go. Unfortunately, it's one of those COVID stories where the engineers and some of the equipment has just not been able to get here yet. And so we don't have the refueling station. That's why they're still sitting in a warehouse, which is a bit frustrating, but we're pleased to have those vehicles in the fleet because it'll give us a chance to test them out. And I think the other thing I would say, and just what are the various segments of the market, is we've talked a lot about cars today. We're also looking at ideas around electric bikes. We've just changed the rules to allow electric scooters to be part of our transport rules here in the ACT. So I think it's not just about cars, it's about this range of electric mobility or zero emission mobility. There's actually the conversations the government needs to be having, or the considerations we need to be looking at.
It's interesting, yeah. Errol just says here that charging will be good for coffee consumption. I'd agree with that, but I'd also flip it around saying that coffee consumption will be good for charging, because that's where I actually choose to charge at the moment. Whichever cafe has a decent, or has got a charging station. So that works out quite well. Okay, let me go. Bringing in manufacturing in Australia, Steve, I mean, you guys produce stuff. I don't know how much you build in Australia. There's a question about, Australia used to have an electric vehicle manufacturing industry. I know there's a couple of smaller firms who are looking at sort of building cars in Australia. How far can Australia go with this and actually sort of building either charging equipment?
I think the manufacturing industry is something that can definitely benefit from EV. I mean, one of the success stories of Victoria is the electric with their Australian-made trucks and electric vehicles there. But I see that there's there's just so much avenue for training, for getting skill sets raised, for generating manufacturing of components, because these vehicles require a different type of servicing. And, you know, it just, the actual market for EV is a generator for new business all around, I believe. And it's shown, you know, with the success, and I'll use C again as an example, which is now exporting as well, and going into overseas markets. So, and it's being recognised, you know, by you know, the Victorian government is supporting that as well. So, yeah, it's definitely a way of recharging the industry. I think there's a number of manufacturers that are looking to manufacture all sorts of vehicles, bikes and cars, in various areas. I think there's a South Australian company that's looking at it at the moment as well. So definitely.
Behyad, I'm just wondering, if you can maybe make a very brief observation about that. And there's a question about grey imports, which I think is a lot of interest. We're fascinated by the response that we've gotten from grey import stories on our website. A lot of people are sort of very interested in getting access to the models which are not otherwise currently available.
Yeah, so I think starting with manufacturing, Steve makes a good point there. You know, we've already got some of those great green shoots with groups like C Electric now starting to expand into North America, Fonzarelli in the sort of bike, the motorized scooter sort of space, things like custom denning, precision buses, making buses here. And this is a bit of a tale as old as time, much like in the charging space we have with Tritium, where we have some of the best brains in the operation, you know, globally set up here out of Australia. And the really great industry development opportunities we get are when those leaders choose to stay in Australia as opposed to sort of have a particular reason to stay in Australia, right? So it's that constant, by helping support our market and, you know, providing that support here in Australia, it means that those brains don't flock overseas and don't say, well, I'll set up my operations in Europe or in Malaysia or in China or in the US, where I'm getting quite a lot of government support for this work, but actually stay here and employ Australians inside of that. And every time they do, I mean, that's where we see, I mean, looking at Tritium, for example, I think they've got this great market presence globally here, and then also being able to land in work like what ABB is doing, getting their local staff to expand out and provide their knowledge to ABB right around the world as well. You know, so there's a sort of good ebb and flow. There's a sort of good two-way flow for that investment to be landed here. For grey imports, we similarly get asked, I think, about this quite often as well. And I think really, for me, it comes down to what is it that we're trying to do with this issue, right? And the question there is, when we talk about vehicle affordability, and particularly for people on lower incomes, we are talking about the second-hand car market. And so how can we get more second-hand vehicles so that people who can't afford a new vehicle can afford an electric one? And really the big thing for us is, how do we get those vehicles here in the first place? Because cheaper electric vehicles exist around the rest of the world. By putting the policies and regulations in, we get them imported into our marketplace, we get them supported by things like advertising that increase consumer education, upskilling service centres that increase industry potential around the country as well. And then by getting more people to choose to buy a new electric vehicle, that means that there will be more second-hand electric vehicles coming in the not too distant future. So, you know, seeding that market and achieving those outcomes is already very available to us. We don't necessarily need a shift there. It's just we need to start getting that encouragement to happen, so that when someone's looking to buy a new car, they buy the electric one as opposed to a petrol or a diesel one.
Guys, we're going to have to wrap up pretty soon. I'm going to ask all panelists to think of sort of final thoughts and final words. But Steve, while you sort of think about your final thoughts and final words, I'm going to throw one more very quickly at you, which is about vehicle to grid. You're charging people, you're going to be in that sort of between the car and the home and the grid. Elon Musk doesn't like the idea, was downplaying it today. I guess that's because he's got his own stationary battery storage, and he probably wants to have all robo fleets running around and stopping only to charge rather than to discharge. But very briefly, how exciting or how attractive or how feasible is that going to be as a storage source, or, you know, a thing of convenience for homeowners and a thing of value for the grid?
I think you've hit it on the mark, convenience. Vehicle to grid is the next big exciting thing for EV charging and for electric vehicles. I mean, driving around in a mobile power supply, and the ability to utilise that power in times gives people choice and allows them to, choose the most economical time to charge their vehicles. Unlike today, where we're locked into fuel prices that the oil companies set, they can allow themselves that choice to charge when they want to. It's also an emergency power supply, which is where vehicle to grid came originally, which was on the Japanese market, where a lot of typhoons and weather events caused a requirement for the vehicles to actually be an emergency power supply, which is also a massive advantage of vehicle to grid. So I think, there's already a trial in the ACT on this, it's moving ahead rapidly. In the interest, again, in the webinar that we were involved in on that was massive. So people definitely, it's another incentive for people to get involved in EV.
Fantastic. Guys, we're just going to wrap up here. Just final thoughts very quickly. Shane Rattenbury.
I think given where Australia's at right now, Giles, targets and certainty are the key to getting things going in this country.
And I'd just like to point out that those are the two things which are missing. So anyway, but let's keep on hoping. Let's keep on hoping. Behyad?
Regardless, it's a very optimistic scenario for electric vehicles, and to Shane's points, things like targets and those policies are about making sure that Australia can share in that optimism.
Evan?
Oh, look, yeah, I'm super optimistic about what we can achieve in the EV space, especially in the public transport context. And, one of the things we'd love to be able to do is to provide a bit of certainty to industry about what our intentions are, which is something I'd love to do in the next couple months. So I hear the calls around certainty. So where we can, I think that's something we'd like to provide for sure.
Fantastic. Steve?
My excitement, I think, Giles, is in the public transport area and heavy haulage. Some of the issues are getting people off the road, moving the pollution and heavy congestion off the road into an emissions-free bus is super exciting for me. I really am excited by that. And similarly, in the heavy haulage space, where people are working in underground mines and those sorts of things in oppressive heat and emissions, just the health factors alone is one of the reasons why I get passionate about EVs. I'm a car guy from way back, but that side of it is the most impressive side for me. So bring it on, I reckon.
Fantastic. Look, I'd just like to thank everyone for being on the panel today. Shane Rattenbury, the Minister for Climate Change and Sustainability, Evan Walker, the Director of Transport for New South Wales Smart Innovation Centre, Behyad Jafari, the CEO of the Electric Vehicle Council, and Steve Amor, the Electric Vehicle Segment Lead from ABB Australia. Thanks to ABB for sponsoring. Thanks to the Smart Energy Council for some technical support. Thanks to all our team here at Driven and Renew Economy for their background information and support and lead up and during this. Thanks to all the participants, fantastic turnout, up to about 500 at one stage, and still a lot of people on here now. Thanks for all those questions. We're going to use them to prompt some of our articles on the Driven coming up in future. A lot of questions about charging at home and solar and how you sort of set up your systems. We're actually hoping to have a webinar on that very topic sometime very soon. And I hope on that webinar, with all due respect to our current panel, that we get a bit more gender balance as well, because I know there's some people it's very important. But look, once again, thank you everyone. It's been fantastic. It's been a long day. It started at 6:30 in the morning with battery day, and now it finishes off this, and we're getting some great feedback from everyone. So thanks everyone for participating, and enjoy the rest of your day.